Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine you're dropped into a complex world where these massive industrial projects meet local communities. And the key to success, it isn't just brilliant engineering. It's profoundly understanding people, building genuine relationships. Today, we're taking a deep dive into something often underestimated but absolutely critical: public involvement in mine development, our guide. It's a detailed chapter from our sources involving the public, forging partnerships and trust. So our mission is to extract the most important nuggets of knowledge about how trust and true partnership are built, or sometimes completely broken in, these really high-stakes environments.
And what's truly fascinating here, I think, is seeing how global agreements and solid empirical evidence, they converge. They show us that public engagement isn't just some corporate social responsibility checkbox. It's really a fundamental pillar for effective and sustainable development, the core takeaway. People are genuinely at the heart of any project's long-term success. You really can't overstate that.
Right. So let's zoom out for a second, set the international stage. You might think this idea of involving the public is relatively new, but our source makes it clear that the push for public voice gained significant momentum way back at the 1992 Earth Summit. Both Agenda 21 and Principle 10 of the Rio Declaration explicitly called for greater public involvement in environmental decision-making.
Exactly. And a really powerful outcome of that, especially in Europe, was the Aarhus Convention in 1998. Now, this isn't just another treaty. It's widely seen as the most comprehensive international agreement on public participation. Its basic principle is quite straightforward. Governments that operate within a robust civil society where citizens are active, informed, well, they're simply more effective. And if you look at the project-level data, the empirical evidence is overwhelming. Projects are just far more successful when stakeholders are truly integrated. Plus, there's the normative side, too. People have a right to be consulted about things that will massively impact their lives. So the fundamental point here: genuine public engagement isn't just nice to have. It's strategically vital. It correlates directly with success, stability, and frankly, ethical governance.
That really drives the point home. It's effectiveness and rights.
Okay, but here's an initial hurdle our source flags, this disparity in terminology. When you just say the public, apparently that often raises concerns for mining companies. They seem to prefer identifying what they call interested and affected parties or stakeholders really early on. Why is that? Is it about specificity?
Yeah, I think specificity is a big part of it. They're looking for that direct sort of causal link. And that idea of involvement itself also has different layers. Our source clarifies three distinct facets. First, there's disclosure. Think of it like a one-way street. Information flows from the company to the public. No real chance for questions or feedback.
Okay, just information out.
Right. Then you move up to consultation. Now it's a two-way flow. The public can give opinions, feedback, and the company commits to consider that input.
So listening happens, but maybe not acting. Well, they commit to consider it. Then finally, there's true participation. That involves shared analysis. It actually gives the public a level of real influence over the project's direction. Historically, yeah, companies often stuck to just disclosure, just telling people what was happening. But experience now clearly shows, and the data backs this up, that genuine two-way communication leads to much lower social risk.
Yeah.
And frankly, greater benefits for everyone involved in the long run. It's a huge shift.
When I think about public participation, I tend to picture it as a fairly modern concept, maybe the last few decades. But our source hints these ideas actually have surprisingly deep historical roots. How far back are we talking? This isn't new at all, is it?
No, absolutely not. It's fascinating, really. The concept of public access to information, participation, justice, it has a surprisingly long lineage. We're talking as far back as 14th centuries in Islamic law, which had provisions for public access to certain information. Then, more recently, the International Boundary Waters Treaty in 1909 between the U.S. and Canada. That's one of the first global treaties with strong provisions for public access and participation regarding shared water resources.
Wow, okay. 1909.
Yeah. And then fast forward, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 laid crucial groundwork: generalized access to information, justice, the right to participate. Then in the USA, the 60s and 70s saw this real participation movement. You had landmark acts like the Freedom of Information Act in 66, unprecedented public access to government data. And NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act in 69, that required public review of environmental impact statements. What happens if we built this? Environmental concern then really went international at the 1972 Stockholm Conference. NGOs played a huge role there. This momentum just solidified at the 92 Earth Summit in Rio, which we mentioned.
Bringing us back.
And then, as we covered, the Aarhus Convention codified those three pillars:
Yeah.
access to information, public participation in decision-making, and access to justice. So the point is, this push for transparency and public voice isn't some new corporate trend. It's a fundamental thread woven through centuries of legal and human rights development.
That's a powerful history lesson, often overlooked, I think. So we've seen the global push. This isn't new. But translating those kind of grand international principles down to the gritty reality of a mine site, that's where the rubber meets the road, isn't it? What does this mean for mandatory consultation at the project level?
Yeah, it's definitely no longer just a suggestion. For all projects with potentially significant impacts, what are often called Category A projects under IFC performance standards, public consultation is mandatory.
Okay, quick clarification maybe. Category A projects and IFC performance standards.
Sure. Category A is basically the highest risk category. Projects with potential for significant adverse environmental and social impacts. And the IFC performance standards are widely used guidelines from the World Bank Group's International Finance Corporation for managing these risks in private sector projects. Lots of banks adopt them.
Got it. Thanks. So mandatory consultation for those big projects.
Mandatory, yes. And the key here is that this consultation needs to be free, prior, and informed. Free means no coercion. Prior means early, before decisions are locked in. And informed. That means timely disclosure of relevant, understandable, accessible information. And it's not a one-off. It has to happen throughout the project's life. It's an ongoing dialogue.
Free, prior, and informed. Okay.
And for Indigenous peoples, there's an even more specific requirement: free, prior, and informed consent, FPIC. This was formally added to IFC Performance Standard 7 back in 2012. It recognizes their inherent right to participate, to have a say in projects directly affecting their lands, their resources, their culture. Now, consent itself, that can be controversial, doesn't mean a veto right, how much unanimity is needed.
Yeah, that sounds tricky.
It is. It's often tied back to the Indigenous people's own customary ways of making decisions. The IFC standard doesn't explicitly equate consent with a veto, so it's quite a nuanced area.
That really clarifies the difference between consultation, which is mandatory for many, and this specific consent requirement for Indigenous peoples. So given all this, identifying who exactly is the public or who the stakeholders are, that sounds incredibly context-specific, but absolutely crucial. Our source defines stakeholders broadly as persons or organizations with an interest, because they will be affected and may have some influence. And it stresses their interests can change, and crucially, you shouldn't exclude any group. That just leads to trouble, like legal action or political blowback.
That's the starting point. And one effective method our source mentions is using a tiered stakeholder involvement approach. To figure out who these stakeholders are, you can ask key questions. The World Bank suggested some good ones back in '95, like who might be affected? Simple enough, but broad. Who owns the land? Critical. Who are the voiceless? Groups who might need special efforts to ensure their input is heard, and who can actually make this project more effective through their participation. You can then map all this out, maybe in a stakeholder matrix. Gives you a clear roadmap.
A roadmap, okay. And among all these faces, our source really emphasizes the project-affected people, PPKs. They're arguably the most critical group. They deserve the highest attention because their daily lives are the most directly impacted by a new mine. What do they generally want? To know what's proposed, obviously, to have their values respected. And they expect benefits. And those benefits aren't always just cash, right?
Absolutely not. It could be infrastructure, jobs, training, land-for-land compensation, many things. And it's fascinating, when companies engage these local communities openly, honestly, those communities can actually become the company's best allies against unfounded opposition from outside.
That's a really interesting dynamic.
It is. And special consideration for minority and Indigenous groups is vital. They're often the most vulnerable. In fact, compulsory consultation specifically for local communities is often a requirement from lenders like the IFC.
Okay, so PPs are front and center. Who else is in this ecosystem?
Beyond the directly affected, several other players have significant stakes. Governments, for instance. They have a very strong interest. Mineral resources are often state property. They set the rules, they facilitate investment, they benefit from taxes, foreign exchange, economic development. They often set up specific commissions to evaluate the impact studies for these big projects.
Makes sense. The state has a big role.
Then you have the company's shareholders or owners. Their natural focus, of course, is economic viability, profitability, maximize shareholder value. But, and this is a noticeable trend, they're increasingly recognizing that dealing with environmental and social issues isn't just fluff. It's crucial for long-term success, for reputation. And you often see projects with major external funding, especially from multilateral lenders, tend to be more environmentally sound simply because those lenders impose stricter requirements.
So the money trail influences standards. Interesting. That covers the immediate financial and regulatory players. Who else is involved, maybe on the funding or security side?
So sticking with funding, you have the multilateral financial institutions, like the World Bank's IFC. Their mandate is broader than just profit. They aim to contribute to development, promote responsible investment, help with education in developing nations. Their involvement often acts as a sort of stamp of respectability.
Yeah.
It signals higher environmental and social standards, and they're definitely sensitive to criticism from activist groups these days.
Okay, the big development banks. What about regular banks?
Commercial financial institutions, your everyday banks. They are, generally speaking, quite conservative. Reputation is everything, so they require rigorous environmental and social assessments. Many actually subscribe to the IFC performance standards through things like the Equator Principle.
Oh, Equator Principle.
Yeah, it's basically a set of risk management guidelines adopted by many financial institutions globally for project finance. It incorporates those IFC standards.
Okay, so commercial banks are following suit.
Then there are the export credit agencies, ECAs, sometimes called the quiet giants of mining finance. These are public agencies. They provide government-backed support, like loans or insurance, for their home country's corporations investing abroad. Often it's tied to buying heavy equipment manufactured back in their home country.
Linking exports to finance. Got it. And insurance.
Insurers, yeah. Two main types here. Project insurance covers loss, damage, third-party liability. Pretty standard. Then there's investment insurance, like political risk insurance, protects against things like war, terrorism, government confiscation. After big disasters like the Baia Mare cyanide spill in Romania, banks became extremely wary of being associated with problematic assets. Insurance plays a big role in managing those risks.
Risk management is key. What about security forces?
Yes, the police and military. In some countries, especially with high lawlessness or insurgency, they might be involved in site security. This is a very delicate balance, upholding human rights versus accepting a dominant state security role. Often, mining companies actually prefer private security. It gives them more direct control and helps avoid potential human rights incidents associated with state forces, like we've unfortunately seen in places like West Papua or Ghana.
A very complex issue there. And finally, NGOs.
Non-governmental organizations, NGOs, they've evolved a lot. They used to be mainly service providers. Now, many are focused on policy change, sometimes called new government organizations. It's a diverse group. You get everything from tiny local suitcase NGOs popping up for one issue to AstroTurf NGOs that look grassroots but are secretly funded by corporate or political interests. They play a significant advocacy role, influencing policy representing various interests.
That's a really comprehensive breakdown of all the different players.
Wow.
And beyond those major groups, our source mentions others. Influential individuals like big landowners, local business folks, religious leaders, plus employees, customers, even the consultants and engineers working on the project. It notes that hiring local academics, say for environmental studies, can be really smart. It helps build local ties, reduces that outsider perception. Okay, we've identified this whole universe of stakeholders. How do you actually engage effectively? Our source introduces something called the Public Consultation and Disclosure Plan, or PCDP. What's its main purpose? Is it like a strategy document?
Exactly. It's your formal guide, your blueprint. Its purpose is to document clear objectives for engagement. Who are we trying to reach? Why? It outlines how you'll identify stakeholders, details your communication strategies, how you'll talk to different groups, and allocates resources, who's doing what with what budget. And within that plan, thinking about how to engage, Roberts back in 2003 laid out those 3 levels we touched on. Simple disclosure, then two-way consultation, and finally, full participation.
Disclosure, consultation, participation.
Okay. And the process itself often follows 5 steps. First, stakeholder mapping, figuring out who's who. Second, education and awareness creation, making sure people understand the basics of the project. Third, the actual consultation and information sharing, that two-way street. Fourth, option building and decision-making where input hopefully shapes outcomes. And finally, consensus building, especially for the long-term stuff like closure plans.
It sounds thorough, but I can already imagine the roadblocks. What are the common barriers that get in the way of this process working smoothly?
Oh, there are definitely significant barriers. Some are attitudinal, project proponents who just aren't willing to genuinely share decision-making power. Or maybe the public feels intimidated by all the technical jargon. Then there are financial barriers. Activist groups, community groups often have very limited budgets compared to a mining company. And finally, procedural barriers. Regulatory processes can be incredibly complex, poorly communicated, or just happen too quickly.
Yeah, I can see how those could derail things. So, given those hurdles, creating an enabling environment for engagement sounds critical. What does that actually look like on the ground?
It really hinges on having the right people involved. You absolutely need a champion in senior management, someone who truly believes in public involvement and will push for it internally. You also need a dedicated lead person for all the communication activities, ideally someone local, culturally sensitive, and a diverse communication team with different skills, maybe someone good at community meetings, someone else good at translating technical stuff. For the consultation itself, the process has to be understandable, easy to participate in, fair. It needs to follow a clear, logical sequence so people know what to expect. And it's not about the company imposing empowerment. It's about creating an environment where communities can empower themselves because they have access to information and maybe some capacity building support.
So it's about enabling, not controlling.
Precisely. And when you think about where to focus your efforts, it's generally best to really engage that middle group, the people who don't have a strong position yet. You don't neglect your supporters, of course. And you do need to engage with anti-mining activists, listen to their concerns, but they probably shouldn't be the primary focus of all your engagement efforts because some opposition might just be intractable.
That makes strategic sense. Focus on the persuadable middle. Now, despite all the best efforts, excellent planning, conflicts seem almost inevitable. You got different needs, different interests colliding. Our source makes an important distinction. A conflict is the underlying disagreement itself, while a dispute is when that conflict goes public, maybe through protests, legal action, media campaigns. So what are the main root causes of these conflicts that our source identifies?
That's a key distinction, yeah. The source breaks down 4 principal types of conflict causes. First, just growing competition for natural resources. Land, water. This can sometimes be managed through compensation, but often non-monetary help, like land-for-land swaps, works better than just cash. Second, structural causes. These are the really deep-seated issues. Conflicts between customary law and state law, for example, or perceived injustices in the wider social, political, or economic system. These are much tougher for a single company to fix.
Yeah, those sound like systemic problems.
They often are. Third, development pressures. Changes the mine itself brings. New technologies, maybe common resources becoming commercialized, migration bringing in new people with different values. And finally, sometimes the natural resource management policies themselves are the problem. Maybe stakeholders weren't identified properly, planning was uncoordinated, information sharing was poor, or there just weren't any effective ways built in to resolve conflicts early on.
So the process itself can cause conflict if it's flawed.
Okay, it sounds like recognizing these causes early is crucial. But once a conflict does flare up into a dispute, how should companies handle it? What are the key mechanisms?
This is where effective grievance mechanisms become absolutely essential. These are strongly supported by frameworks like IFC Performance Standard 1, the UN Human Rights Council. They're widely recognized best practice. A good grievance mechanism provides a predictable, transparent, and credible process. It builds trust. Crucially, it also helps companies spot emerging issues early, so they can take preemptive action before things escalate. Think of it as a reliable, structured way for local people and the company to find solutions together, ideally locally, without always having to resort to courts or major campaigns.
A formal channel for complaints and resolution. Makes sense. Let's look at the benefits and risks now, the double-edged sword of public involvement. What are the clear benefits for mining companies when they actually get this engagement piece right? Oh, the benefits are substantial. Our source makes it clear. It directly reduces financial risks and costs. Think fewer delays, fewer lawsuits. It fosters positive community perceptions, which is invaluable. And it significantly enhances the overall corporate image or reputation. It's really just common sense and good business sense, because the alternative lack of community support inevitably leads to opposition, costly disputes, project delays, maybe even violence, and just damaging negative publicity. It's a minefield, literally and figuratively, if you get it wrong.
Avoid the minefield.
Yeah.
And the social benefits for the communities themselves. How does their input actually make things better on the ground?
Their input is incredibly valuable. It significantly improves the quality of environmental and social impact assessments. Local people know their environment. It helps evaluate project alternatives. Maybe there's a better way to route a road or manage water. It strengthens mitigation measures by incorporating that local knowledge. Communities know what works, what doesn't in their context. And when communities are genuinely informed, they can better understand the trade-offs, the pros and cons. They can contribute meaningfully to the mine's design and ultimately develop greater trust and support. It becomes more collaborative.
Okay, so clear benefits on both sides. Now, the flip side, what are the risks involved in opening up this process? Our source warns that the participation process itself can become a source of conflict if things go wrong, if outcomes don't meet expectations, or people feel the process wasn't genuine.
Absolutely, and that's a huge danger. Probably the main risk of early public involvement is inadvertently creating unrealistic demands and expectations. This often happens if companies, maybe in their enthusiasm, overstate the potential benefits. Or worse, make promises they simply can't keep. And a critical point here, promises made by external consultants are almost always perceived by the community as company promises. So managing those consultants carefully is absolutely vital.
That's a really important operational point. Consultant promises, company promises.
Definitely. Another risk is land speculation. Once the project's land requirements become known, you can get a rush of people making claims, or prices can skyrocket. An early, detailed land ownership census is the best defense here. Though, interestingly, transparency, which is usually good, can actually be counterproductive specifically for land acquisition, as it can fuel that speculation if done too early or without context.
That's a tricky balancing act. Transparency versus managing speculation. So, what does this all mean for actually doing this right on the ground? Our source offers a really useful map of common pitfalls to avoid. This feels crucial. What's the absolute #1 mistake companies make? The biggest trust killer.
Without a doubt, it's promises that are not kept. It sounds simple, but it happens. If you promise jobs or improved water supply or road upgrades, you will be held accountable. Failing to deliver destroys trust, potentially permanently. Another huge one is doing too little, too late. If key decisions have basically already been made behind closed doors, then any consultation offered afterwards just feels like window dressing. It loses all meaning. People need sufficient time to understand, to form opinions, to express their views, and for that input to genuinely have a chance of influencing the outcome.
Timing and substance are everything.
Then there's the old top-down approach. Just informing people what you've decided. That's not engagement. Good practice now demands involving the public, involving key stakeholders at all stages, fostering a genuine bottom-up flow of ideas and concerns. And closely related is being not sincere or transparent. Any hint of manipulation just kills trust instantly. Hiding information, especially about potential negative impacts, or only highlighting the positives, people see through that and credibility plummets.
So authenticity is key. What about trying to buy goodwill?
Yeah, the idea of buying support. Look, paying for legitimate expenses covering transport costs for people to attend meetings may be a reasonable per diem for their time, especially if it's customary, that's generally seen as fair. But outright payments for support, that's a really short-sighted and problematic approach. It creates dependency, resentment, unhealthy dynamics. Avoid it.
Okay, so don't try to buy support. What about trying to make everyone happy?
That's another trap. Trying to please everyone. It's unrealistic and, frankly, inefficient. Some opposition, particularly from certain ideologically driven anti-mining activists, might simply be intractable. You listen, you engage respectfully, but you have to focus your main efforts on addressing legitimate, solvable concerns from the broader community. And a critical error here is failing to recognize diversity and various interest groups within the community. You can't just talk to the leaders or the most vocal men. You need to make specific efforts to include disadvantaged groups, minorities, women, ensure you're getting a real cross-section of perspectives. Overlooking groups leads to resentment, and you miss vital insights.
That's so important, ensuring all voices are heard, not just the loudest.
Absolutely. Then there's the problem of mixed messages.
Right.
If the community relations team says one thing and the CEO says something else in the media, it completely undermines public trust. You need consistent, coordinated communication from all company representatives throughout the entire project lifecycle, right through to closure. And a huge issue, especially in cross-cultural contexts, is a lack of cultural sensitivity. Information has to be culturally appropriate. It needs to be in local languages. Technical jargon words like tailings, the mine waste needs to be clearly explained in plain terms. Don't assume people understand industry speak.
Explain tailings, not just say tailings. Got it.
Exactly. And then there's the practical stuff. Lack of documentation. It sounds boring, but it's essential. The whole process, who participated, what issues were raised, what the company's response was, how public input actually influenced decisions, it all needs to be meticulously documented. It's vital for transparency and accountability down the line. And crucial for making participation meaningful is addressing the lack of capacity building. If you don't invest time and resources in training your own staff, government officials, community members, local NGOs so they can actually participate effectively, then the engagement won't be as meaningful as it could be. Host speaker. That's such a vital point. It's not just about the company communicating out, it's about building the capacity for everyone to engage in. Any other common mistakes that stand out? Definitely. A failure to be flexible is a big one. Consultation isn't one size fits all. You need to adapt your mechanisms to the local context, to the specific needs of different stakeholder groups. Also, being not community focused. Allowing discussions to get bogged down in individual demands or self-interest, rather than steering towards broader community benefits and shared societal needs. That's a common trap. And this is a subtle but important one. The failure to differentiate between releasing information and actually informing the public. Just dumping gigabytes of technical reports online doesn't mean anyone understands it better. Information needs to be curated, translated, explained, contextualized to genuinely inform people.
Data dump versus genuine understanding. Big difference.
Huge difference. And finally, other pitfalls include things like simply not following local customary or legal requirements for consultation, dismissing community suggestions as too expensive without really analyzing them properly, or making statements that imply environmental protection is somehow bad for the project. Those are major red flags.
Wow. That's quite a list of potential missteps.
Yeah.
It really highlights how complex this is. We've taken a really deep dive here into this intricate world of public involvement in mine development. From its surprisingly deep historical roots and the huge range of stakeholders, to that delicate dance of effective engagement and managing inevitable conflict. It's crystal clear that forging partnerships and building trust isn't some simple task you tick off a list. It's absolutely essential continuous work for any project hoping for genuine long-term success. It's really about building that social license to operate, one conversation, one action at a time.
And if we try to connect this to the bigger picture, given these inherent complexities, all the diverse interests involved, and the ever-increasing global demand for resources, it does raise an important question, doesn't it? What does truly successful public involvement look like in the long term, beyond just the life of the mine, especially as local voices globally are becoming louder, more connected through technology? It's a challenge, I think, that will just continue to evolve. It demands constant learning, constant adaptation from everyone involved.
That's a powerful thought to leave us with. And maybe for you listening, think about how these principles, transparency, respect, genuine dialogue, addressing grievances fairly, might apply beyond mining. Think about any large-scale development, maybe even smaller local initiatives in your own community. The hard-won lessons from mining engagement can shed really valuable light on how to build trust and achieve real, lasting collaboration just about anywhere.